Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, the philosophy of science, but with a twist.
A twist.
Yeah, we're looking at it specifically in Latin America.
Yeah.
And we're going to approach it as if explaining it to, like, a fellow philosopher.
Yeah.
Someone already steeped in the ideas and history.
Ah, I see. So like a high-level philosophical briefing.
Exactly. And our main source here is a seriously in-depth entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's pretty comprehensive.
Sounds like we've got a solid base for this deep dive then.
For sure. And for our listeners, who I know appreciate getting right to the good stuff, we'll be distilling all this down to the most important developments, debates, and those key figures who've shaped the philosophy of science in Latin America.
Absolutely. The goal is to highlight what would really resonate with a philosophical mind. The historical influences, how different methods have evolved, and those core philosophical questions that have been tackled.
Right. So if we're thinking like philosophers looking at this, we need to start with the setting 19th century Latin America, fresh off those independence movements. The sources suggest a lot of initial hope pinned on science as a path to progress. Why do you think that was?
Well, it's crucial to understand the context. See, after independence, a lot of Latin American nations struggled politically, socially. The progress they'd hoped for didn't quite materialize.
So they looked to what was happening in Europe with science booming.
Exactly. Science was seen as this beacon of reason and progress, a potential model for them to follow.
A way to sort of leapfrog over those struggles.
Yes, and it wasn't just naive optimism. It was a reasoned response to the perceived shortcomings of the existing systems. They were looking for a fresh start.
Makes sense. And this is where French positivism comes in, right? The Auguste Comte at the forefront. But it went beyond just, liking scientific findings. It was a whole system impacting society and politics.
Absolutely. For a philosopher, it's key to grasp that positivism wasn't just a method. It was a complete worldview.
Like a whole philosophical package deal.
Precisely. In the mid to late 19th century, it was seen as this ready-made system for progress. Observation, scientific method as the ultimate form of knowledge, those were central.
And this focus on order, secular governance, that must have resonated in Latin America, especially as they were trying to move beyond their colonial past, right?
You hit the nail on the head. They wanted to build modern, stable nations on what they saw as objective, rational principles. And those principles applied to both philosophy and politics.
And it wasn't just theory. It really took hold across the continent. Like in Brazil, even their motto, order and progress, comes straight from Comte.
It does, from his System de Politique Pazia.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful symbol for a philosopher to consider. It signifies this deep commitment to those positivist ideals.
It wasn't just a slogan. It was woven into the fabric of the nation.
Right. And it even got a kind of quasi-religious following in Brazil. Thinkers like Miguel de Lemos promoted a religion of humanity based on Comte's ideas, even leading to humanity temples being built.
So it went beyond just intellectual agreement.
Mm-hmm.
It became almost like a social and spiritual movement.
Exactly. It shows just how deeply positivism was embraced in a bunch of different ways.
And this wasn't limited to Brazil. Argentina, they had their own positivist thing going on, emphasizing public education as the key to progress.
Yes, public education was huge for them, and you had figures like Domingo Faustino Sarmiento championing that, scientists like Florentino Emigino, physician philosophers like Jose Ingenieros and Alejandro Korn, all applying scientific thinking to philosophical questions.
It was like this multidisciplinary effort driven by positivism.
Exactly. Even educators like Pedro Scalabrini and lawyers like Carlos Octavio Bunge, Mario Bunge's uncle, were on board with this idea. A modern, scientifically grounded public education system was fundamental for progress.
It was positivism applied to nation building, basically.
Right. They believed that an educated populace, informed by science and reason, was the foundation for a strong and modern nation.
And Mexico, our sources point out how positivism really shook up their education system.
Oh, absolutely. In Mexico, it was Gabino Barreda leading the charge. And for a philosopher, what's fascinating is that this wasn't just adding a few science classes. It was a deliberate restructuring of the whole system.
Like a philosophical overhaul.
Exactly. They removed religious instruction, traditional metaphysics, those were out. Science, a positivist worldview, those were in. Barreda even centralized higher education under this framework. It was a huge shift in how future generations were educated.
It wasn't just a change in what they learned, but in how they thought.
Right. It was a fundamental shift in their approach to knowledge and education.
And it didn't stop there. This positivist wave went beyond these big centers, reaching Chile, Colombia, Peru, even Bolivia.
Oh, it spread far and wide.
Yeah.
In Chile, you had the Lagarrigue brothers, Jorge and Enrique, pushing Comte's philosophy and his religion of humanity. Colombia had Rafael Núñez, their president, who was into positivist policies.
Wow, so it really reached the highest levels of government.
It did. And Peru had Javier Prado, Manuel González Prada, promoting similar ideas. They even incorporated some Spencerian evolutionism in there.
So it wasn't just Comte's positivism, other related ideas were getting mixed in.
Right. It was like this broader movement towards scientific thinking and its application to society. And even in Bolivia, they had this group, the Círculo Literario, translating works by Darwin, Dumont, Haeckel, all reflecting this interest in scientific naturalism.
It was like a continent-wide intellectual awakening, fueled by this belief that science held the keys to progress.
Exactly. Positivism and these related ideas, they offered a seemingly clear and objective path forward. And that was incredibly appealing in the context of those post-independence challenges.
But, as our sources point out, this initial wave of optimism eventually hit a wall.
Right. It's important to acknowledge that, despite all the enthusiasm and adoption of these ideas, the grand-scale progress they hoped for, it didn't happen as quickly or completely as many had imagined.
So the gap between the promise and the reality started to show.
It did. And that started to eat away at the faith that positivism was this cure-all for societal problems.
It's a bit like you can have the best blueprint, but if the building materials are flawed, the structure won't stand.
That's a great analogy. And from a philosophical standpoint, it raises questions about relying solely on technocratic or purely scientific solutions for complex social issues.
And then World War I happened, which must have been a huge blow. I mean, here was science, supposedly this force for progress, being used for incredibly destructive purposes.
Oh, absolutely. For anyone watching from Latin America, that war was a wake-up call. It seriously challenged that naive faith in the inevitable positive march of science.
It showed that science could be just as easily used for harm as for good.
Right. Seeing those advancements in technology used for such destruction, it really shook things up globally.
So by the 1920s, positivism starts to lose its grip as the dominant intellectual force in Latin America. What filled the void? What came next?
Well, you see a rise in more critical social and political philosophies. Marxism, for one, it offered a different lens for understanding societal issues and pushing for change.
So a move towards philosophies that were more focused on social structures and power dynamics?
Yes. And there was also a resurgence in those philosophical schools that weren't so sold on purely empirical thinking. Think Bergsonian spiritualism, with its emphasis on intuition and phenomenology, which focused on subjective experience.
So a shift back towards perspectives that considered the individual's experience and interpretation of reality.
Exactly. And later you have existentialism coming in, grappling with questions of meaning and purpose in what seemed to many like an indifferent universe. And interestingly, there was this renewed interest in metaphysics, but maybe in a less rigid way than before.
So a willingness to grapple with those big questions about reality and existence that science, on its own, maybe couldn't answer.
Precisely. It was a move towards a more holistic approach to knowledge and understanding.
Now, fast forward a bit, and our sources talk about a revival of philosophy of science in Latin America starting in the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
But there were some major disruptions along the way, those military coups in the 60s.
Right. Those coups, like the one in Brazil in '64, they had a chilling effect on intellectual life.
Governments cracking down on academics, especially those with perceived leftist leanings. That must have been a tough time.
It was. A lot of talented people left, and whole fields of study were disrupted. But what's remarkable is how resilient the intellectual community was.
They didn't give up, even under pressure.
Not at all. They found ways to rebuild, to keep the conversation going. And João Paulo Monteiro was key in this. He founded the journal Ciência ou Filosofia.
In 1970, right. For a philosopher, what's the significance of a journal like that during such a tumultuous time?
Well, imagine a community that's been fractured, silenced. A journal becomes a lifeline. It's a space to share ideas, to debate, to reconnect.
It becomes a symbol of intellectual resistance in a way.
Exactly. And with Ciência Filosofia, Monteiro specifically wanted to promote a broader, more critical engagement with the philosophy of science.
Moving away from that rigid positivism that dominated before.
Right. It was about opening up the field, embracing diverse perspectives and logic and philosophy of science. It was a crucial step in rebuilding the community and pushing the field forward.
And then there's Oswaldo Porchat, a pivotal figure. He was at USP, then later Unicamp, where he established the Centro de Lógica, Epistemologia y Historia da Ciencia, or CLE for short.
CLE was huge. It was more than just a research center. Under Porchat's leadership, it became a beacon of hope for philosophers, historians of science, logicians, everyone.
Kind of gathering place for all these different minds to interact.
Exactly. It provided this much-needed sense of stability and fostered a really dynamic intellectual environment. Seminars, conferences, visiting scholars, they were all happening at CLE.
It was like a fertile ground for ideas to grow and spread.
Absolutely. Porchat really understood the need for a strong institutional base to support the revitalization of the field, and he made it happen.
And CLE went beyond research. They became a publisher, too, putting out some influential journals and book series.
Right. They launched Manuscrito in 77, Cadernos de Filosofía y Historia da Ciencia in 80, and the Colesso CLE book series in 87. And for a philosopher, that's a big deal.
It's like having your own platform to shape the direction of the field and reach a wider audience.
Exactly. It wasn't just about doing research, it was about disseminating it, building a lasting intellectual legacy. And CLE was instrumental in that.
Now, one name keeps popping up from this period, Newton C. da Costa, especially for his work on pair-consistent logic. For a philosopher, someone who may not specialize in logic, what was so groundbreaking about da Costa's work?
So imagine this. Classical logic says a single contradiction can crumble a whole theory. Da Costa's work challenged that. He said, hey, we can build logical systems that handle contradictions without everything falling apart.
Like a logic that's more tolerant of inconsistencies?
Precisely. And that's huge because in the real world, we deal with incomplete, sometimes even contradictory information. Da Costa's paraconsistent logic offered a way to reason with that kind of data without getting stuck.
So it opened up new ways of thinking about truth, knowledge, even the foundations of math and science.
Exactly. His work had a profound impact on how we understand those core concepts. It's no wonder he became an international figure in mathematics, logic, and philosophy of science. And his work is still being developed today by people like Italo d'Ottaviano and Walter Carnelli.
So CLE becomes this vibrant hub, and it's not just logic, it's branching out into all these other areas of philosophy of science.
Oh, it's incredibly diverse. They were supporting research on the nature of science itself, analyzing its theories, even looking at its applications in education.
That's a pretty wide scope.
It was, and they really emphasized critical thinking, dialogue, and collaboration. They had all these seminars, international collaborations, tons of initiatives to keep the intellectual energy flowing.
It sounds like they were creating a real community of scholars.
They were, and that's one of CLE's biggest legacies.
And it wasn't just homegrown talent, right? In the 80s, Campinas attracted some big names from the international scene.
Yeah, Michael Gins came, Harvey Brown, Stephen French. They brought in fresh perspectives, especially in philosophy of physics, mathematics, and using formal methods in philosophy of science.
So they're not just rebuilding, they're now connecting with the broader intellectual world.
Exactly. This exchange of ideas, it was crucial for the development of analytic philosophy there. It exposed local scholars to the latest debates and methodologies, really broadened their horizons.
Our sources talk about a particularly fruitful partnership between French and da Costa. That must have been an exciting time for philosophy of science in Campinas.
It was. Their collaboration was super productive. They dug into quantum mechanics, particularly its metaphysical implications, and made strides in structuralism, too.
Those are pretty dense areas of philosophy.
They are. But French and da Costa, they didn't shy away from the tough stuff. They even proposed new ways to think about truth itself, coming up with the concepts like pragmatic truth and partial truth as alternatives to the traditional binary views.
So they were pushing the boundaries of philosophical inquiry.
Absolutely. And their work culminated in this book, Science and Partial Truth, came out in 2003. It made a real splash in philosophical circles.
It's like a testament to the power of collaboration, bringing together different perspectives to tackle complex problems.
Exactly. It shows what can happen when you create the kind of stimulating environment where people from different backgrounds can come together and really engage with each other's ideas.
And what's interesting is that even after those international scholars moved on, their connections to Brazilian research groups remained strong.
That says a lot about the kind of community they built there. The ties went beyond just professional courtesy. They were genuine, lasting intellectual connections.
It's a reminder that the best collaborations often leave a ripple effect that continues long after the initial project is done.
It does. Those ongoing relationships help sustain and even further develop those research areas in Brazil.
Now, Brazil was a big hub, but our sources mention significant developments in other Latin American countries as well, places like Colombia, Peru, and Chile.
Right. In Colombia, you had Mario Lacerna way back in the 50s at Universidad de los Andes. He was a big proponent of logic and the scientific philosophy of Hans Reichenbach, and that laid the groundwork for some important contributions from Colombian philosophers later on.
So those early pioneers paved the way for future generations.
Exactly. And in Peru, things started buzzing around the National University of San Marcos, or UNMSM, and the Sociedad Peruana de Filosofía.
So it wasn't just individuals. Institutions were starting to play a role in fostering philosophical inquiry.
For sure. And a key figure there was Francisco Miro Quesada. He was a pioneer in logic, and he even had a hand in naming and popularizing Da Costa's paraconsistent logic.
So a real champion of those innovative ideas in logic.
He was. And in Chile, you had Gerald Stahl, Nathan Stemmer, and Augusto Pescador doing important work on logic in the 60s. And then there's Roberto Turretti.
He's the one who wrote extensively on Kant, right?
Yes. He's known for his work on Kant, but he also made major contributions to the history of science, looking at figures like Galileo, Newton, even Einstein. He was a prolific scholar and a really influential figure in Chilean philosophy.
Sounds like he was a giant in the field.
He was. And then you can't forget Argentina and Uruguay, especially when we're talking about the development of analytic philosophy.
Right, that whole southern cone region had its own dynamic intellectual scene going on.
It did. And the arrival of Hans Lindemann in Argentina in the 40s really kicked things off. He inspired people like Mario Bunge, Gregorio Klimovsky, even the mathematician Julio Rey Pastor, all of whom were deeply interested in philosophy.
So it was a meeting of minds from different disciplines, all united by this passion for philosophical inquiry.
Exactly, and the 50s were a golden age in Argentina. You had institutes like the Instituto Libre de Estudios Superiores, with Klimovsky and Garcia, and Bunge's own Círculo Filosófico.
It was like a breeding ground for new ideas and approaches.
It was. And that's when Bunge's early work, including his influential book Causalidad, started to gain recognition. These developments turned the University of Buenos Aires, UBA for short, into a world-class center for philosophy.
And Causalidad itself, it was a significant work, gaining international attention for its realist take on causality.
It was a landmark book, published in 1959. And for a philosopher interested in how ideas travel and influence each other, it's really important. Here's a work from Latin America, engaging with and contributing to these global philosophical debates. Bunge's realist view of causality, it offered a strong counterpoint to the more Humean, purely correlation-based accounts that were popular at the time.
So it wasn't just about Latin American philosophers working in isolation. They were participating in and shaping these international conversations.
Exactly. And Bunge, his whole career was about rigorous, scientifically informed philosophy. He championed those values throughout his work, both in Argentina and later when he moved to McGill.
A real advocate for raising the bar for philosophical scholarship.
Absolutely. He was a towering figure, and his work continues to inspire philosophers today.
But sadly, this promising period in Argentina was cut short. First, Bunge left in '63, and then the military intervention in universities in '66 led to an exodus of intellectuals.
It was a huge loss for Argentine philosophy. Many brilliant minds, either by force or choice, had to leave the country to pursue their work.
A real brain drain.
It was. But again, you see that resilience. Klimovsky stayed and worked to keep things going, and new talent emerged.
They rebuilt again.
They did. And by the late 70s, early 80s, they'd founded SADF, the Sociedad Argentina de Análisis Filosófico, and launched two key journals, Revista Latinoamericana de Filosofía and Análisis Filosófico.
So they didn't let those disruptions completely derail their progress.
Not at all. Their dedication to philosophy was unshakable.
Okay, so we've traced this fascinating historical arc. Now let's zoom in on some of the key themes and debates that are shaping contemporary Latin American philosophy of science. And a natural starting point is the scientific method itself.
Right. How we understand the way science works, that's fundamental. And Gregorio Klimovsky, he continued to champion a hypothetico-deductive approach, arguing that it applies to both natural and social sciences.
So the idea that you formulate hypotheses, deduce predictions, and test them against empirical evidence, that was still central.
It was, and Popper's work on falsification, it also gained traction. You had scholars like Verdugo and Velasco Gomez exploring those ideas further.
So testing theories, trying to prove them wrong, that's Popper's thing.
Exactly. And then you have others like Cassini who were drawn to Bayesian confirmation theory, how evidence strengthens our belief in a hypothesis.
So it's not just about falsification, it's about how we weigh evidence to support scientific claims.
Right. And then there's this whole thing called the semantic approach to scientific theories. It's about focusing on the models that theories describe rather than their strict logical formulation.
So it's more about how those theories represent the world rather than just their internal logic.
Exactly. Scholars like Pérez Ranzan, Guerrero Pino, Jaramillo Uribe, they were all digging into different aspects of this approach.
So a lot of different ways to think about the scientific method itself, and then there's the question of how scientific knowledge changes over time. What have Latin American philosophers contributed to that conversation?
Well, Rolando Garcia, who collaborated with Jean Piaget, he did a lot of work on genetic epistemology, how our understanding of the world develops, both individually and historically.
So connecting the growth of individual knowledge with the evolution of scientific understanding.
Exactly. It's this fascinating interplay between psychology and the history of science. And Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions, that's been hugely influential across the region, too.
Kuhn, with his paradigms and paradigm shifts, he really shook things up in philosophy of science.
He did. Scholars in Cuba, Uruguay, Colombia, Argentina, they've all grappled with Kuhn's ideas. The nature of scientific revolutions as shifts in thinking, the problem of incommensurability between different paradigms.
The idea that distant scientific frameworks might be so different that it's hard to even compare them.
Right. Those are all big, thorny questions. And Latin American philosophers have definitely made their mark in those discussions.
And of course, no discussion of philosophy of science is complete without touching on scientific realism, the debate about whether our theories are truly describing an objective reality.
Right. It's a classic debate. And in Latin America, you have people like Borges and Gentile who've done great overviews of the arguments for and against realism.
So laying out the philosophical landscape, so to speak.
Exactly. And more recently, there's been a lot of interest in Anjan Chakravarty's work on selective realism.
Selective realism, the idea that we can be realist about some parts of our theories, but not necessarily all of them.
Right. It's a more nuanced approach, and scholars like Soto and Romero have been exploring this in depth, particularly local selective realism. And then there's Sears, who's applying dispositional realism to these debates.
So a lot of sophisticated work being done on these fundamental questions about the nature of scientific knowledge.
Absolutely.
Now, let's shift gears and look at the philosophy of specific sciences. Our sources suggest philosophy of physics has seen a real boom lately in Latin America.
It has. And this is despite some early figures like Bunge and Toretti leaving. But a lot of that energy is coming from Olympia Lombardi's research group.
They've been doing some groundbreaking work, haven't they?
They have. They've focused heavily on the interpretation of quantum mechanics, specifically developing something called the modal Hamiltonian interpretation.
It's a realist interpretation.
It is. It says that quantum properties have definite values, even when they're not being measured, and they don't buy into wave function collapse.
So no collapsing cats, in their view.
Exactly. They've also explored how decoherence plays into the measurement problem and what it means for the very being of quantum stuff.
Quantum ontology.
Yeah.
It's a mouthful.
It is. But they're even using some pretty out there tools like quasi-set theory to tackle issues like quantum contextuality and the fact that you can't distinguish identical quantum particles.
Sounds like they're not afraid to get their hands dirty with the technical stuff.
Nope. And on top of that, you have people like Castagnino and Lombardi looking at the arrow of time, why time seems to flow in one direction.
A classic philosophical puzzle.
It is. And then there's work on superdeterminism, the idea that everything, even our choices, might be predetermined that's getting some attention. And there are others tackling conservation laws and semi-classical gravity, relational quantum mechanics, how we can consistently measure quantum systems, you name it. There's even work specifically on the weirdness of time reversal in quantum mechanics.
It seems like philosophy of physics in Latin America is firing on all cylinders.
It is. They're taking on some of the biggest questions in physics and pushing the boundaries of philosophical inquiry.
And what about the philosophy of chemistry? It seems like a newer but growing area.
Yes. It's picking up steam. You have philosophers tackling big questions about the nature of chemical stuff, what it is, how it behaves. They're even looking at it from a Kantian perspective, which is interesting.
So applying philosophical frameworks from the past to these contemporary scientific issues.
Exactly. And they're exploring the implications of nanomaterials, that whole new world of tiny tech. And of course, the relationship between chemistry and technology is a big one.
It seems like philosophy of chemistry is really finding its footing.
It is. It's an exciting area to watch.
Philosophy of biology, that's another vibrant area.
Oh, it's booming. Traditional topics like natural selection, those are still actively debated. But there's also tons of work on newer stuff, like mechanistic explanation and how organisms develop, the whole tangled web of multi-level causation in biology, the concept of the gene, what it even means in the age of genomics.
And the philosophical implications of all these advances in biology are pretty mind-blowing.
They are. And there's this whole other field, philosophy of ethnobiology, which looks at the intersection of biological knowledge and cultural practices. It's super interesting.
So they're not just focused on the hard science, they're looking at how it interacts with culture and society.
Right. It's a more holistic approach to thinking about biology.
Makes sense. And what about the formal sciences, like logic and mathematics?
Well, logic, especially paraconsistent logic, has been a real strength in Latin America. I mean, Da Costa's legacy is still going strong.
So they're building on those foundational contributions.
They are. They're developing new logics of formal inconsistency, exploring different approaches to reasoning with contradictions.
It sounds like they're really pushing the boundaries of what logic can do.
They are. And beyond logic, you have philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of economics, even philosophy of history, all making important contributions.
So it's not just about the empirical sciences. They're tackling the philosophical foundations of all these different fields.
Exactly. They're engaged in this broad, multifaceted exploration of knowledge and reasoning across the board.
And with technology shaping every aspect of our lives these days, it's no surprise that philosophy of technology is a growing area too.
Oh, absolutely. It's a hot topic. They're debating the nature of artifacts, the impact of biotechnology, how technology evolves culturally, the ethical implications of all this new tech.
So they're not just looking at how technology works, they're grappling with what it means for us as humans.
Exactly. It's a crucial area of philosophical inquiry, and it's getting a lot of attention in Latin America.
It's interesting how in all these different areas, they seem to be going beyond just abstract analysis. They're connecting their philosophical investigations to real-world issues, social concerns.
You're picking up on a key trend. There's this growing awareness that philosophy of science can't just stay in the ivory tower. It has to engage with the real world, with those broader social and political dimensions of science and technology.
It's about making philosophy relevant, connecting it to the challenges we face as a society.
Right. It's about recognizing that science and technology don't exist in a vacuum. They're embedded in social, political, ethical contexts. And philosophers have a responsibility to analyze those contexts, to raise critical questions, to contribute to a more informed and nuanced understanding of how science and technology shape our world.
It sounds like they're moving towards a more engaged, socially conscious approach to philosophy of science.
They are, and that's really exciting to see.
Okay, so wrapping up, looking back at this whole journey through Latin American philosophy of science, what are some of the big takeaways? What stands out for you?
Well, one thing is clear. There's been a real shift from those early days of positivism. There's this incredible diversification of thought, a willingness to embrace different approaches and perspectives.
So moving away from that kind of monolithic view of science and embracing a more pluralistic approach.
Exactly. And there's a growing awareness of the social and political context of science, this desire to connect philosophical inquiry with those real-world issues.
To bridge that gap between the abstract and the concrete.
Right. And while there's not necessarily one unified Latin American school of thought, there are definitely common threads, shared concerns that run through a lot of the work being done.
Like a shared intellectual heritage, shaped by those unique historical and social experiences.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying Latin American philosophy of science so fascinating. It offers this unique perspective, this rich and nuanced way of thinking about science, its methods, its role in society, and its impact on our lives.
It's a reminder that philosophy of science isn't just this abstract universal thing. It's shaped by the context, by the history, by the lived experiences of those who are doing the thinking.
Right. It's a human endeavor, just like science itself.
So for our listeners, for those philosophers out there who are maybe encountering this rich tradition for the first time, what's the one big question they should be pondering as they delve deeper?
I think the most important thing to consider is this. How do those specific socio-political contexts, those unique historical experiences, actually shape the very questions that philosophers ask and the methods they use to answer them? Think about what we've discussed today, the challenges Latin America has faced, the triumphs they've achieved, and how those experiences might have led them to focus on certain areas of philosophy of science, to develop certain approaches, to grapple with particular questions that might not be as prominent elsewhere.
It's about recognizing the diversity of thought, the richness that comes from exploring different philosophical landscapes.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole journey of exploring philosophy so rewarding. You're constantly expanding your horizons, discovering new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing the world. And Latin American philosophy of science, it offers a treasure trove of insights for anyone willing to take the plunge.
Well said. I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive.
It has been a fascinating exploration.
Until next time.